very much. It was a pleasure serving you today. Thank you. Hi there, good morning. How can I help you?
Can I have a cardamom bun?
Of course.
And a mocha, please.
And a mocha, great. So that's £2.50. Well, £3, that'll be £5.50, please. Can I see some ID?
What's that?
Passport, national ID card. No, we just need to confirm your nationality before we make the purchase.
Why?
It's for operational reasons.
Okay, that's quite an unusual thing to ask, isn't it?
Sorry about that. Thank you very much.
I'm French.
French, okay, sorry, that's going to be £7.50 then, please. So I'm afraid there are no panel raisins for German customers. It's a management decision. The Irish rate is actually quite generous. I'm so sorry.
See you another time.
Sure to go. Hi there. Belgian, that's going to be £12 then, please.
Because I'm Belgian.
Yeah.
Can I still pay the standard rate, please?
No, that would be £7.50, please. And if you could just fill in the form, and then your coffee and pastry ready at the end. Thank you.
There we go.
I can take the money for it here, but you'd have to go around the corner to actually collect it. That's because of the Singaporean side. So that's just one loaf of bread.
Yes.
Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, you're from Bulgaria?
Yes.
I'm so sorry, we can't actually sell loaves to Bulgarian citizens.
Really?
We've been doing this for a while. It's like an industry standard practice, actually.
Where?
Oh, absolutely everywhere. Can I just check your nationality, please?
Italian.
Sorry. Just hand me the loaf, please. Yeah, unfortunately, we can't sell to Italians. I'm so sorry.
Wow, that was just like mental.
Hello everyone and welcome to the online consumer experience. My name is Agustin Reyna. I work for the European Consumer Organization, BEUC, in Brussels. We represent 42 independent consumer associations across the EU, and one of our objectives is actually help the EU legislators to make the single market a reality for consumers, and single market in which everybody from anywhere in the EU can access safe products and from any retailer provider of the choice across the EU. But what is important to bear in mind is that our starting point is the single market. And why is important? Because since the adoption of the Single European Act in the late 80s, the member states decided to join forces, cooperate with a common objective. One of these objectives was the development of a single market, because they realized that all countries cooperating, sharing their national markets are much more stronger than on their own. So we have seen over the last 3 decades a lot of harmonization, consumer law, standardization, with the objectives of creating common legal frameworks across the EU so everybody can make businesses easier. But when it comes to the online environment, in particular audiovisual services and copyrighted content, that is not the reality. We still live in silos. Content is being produced, and a lot, in the different member states, but they stay within the boundaries of each country. It was already mentioned before that, unfortunately, consumers do not have the possibility to access online content from platforms in other member states. And this has several effects. Of course, we have less access, but at the same time, there is an increase of unauthorized downloading because consumers expect to be able to find the content they want on the internet. But if they cannot find it, then they will go to unauthorized sources. This also implies restrictions on cross-border competition, consumer dissatisfaction, but what is more worrisome, there is an effect of cultural locked in. So all this wonderful culture that we have in the member states, they cannot go beyond the national boundaries. And there are basically three reasons why geo-blocking happens in the single market. First, we have contractual agreements. So rights holders and distributors, they include clauses in which they specifically say that the distributors are not allowed to give access to consumers coming from other countries, other member states. There are also geofiltering technologies, the famous DRMs that are applied through IP localization, but even then implemented through restriction, for example, on the means of payments that you can use. And of course, one of the important reasons that was mentioned already in the previous presentation is the fragmentations of EU copyright law. But then if you will look at the contractual agreements of how content is being licensed in the EU, over 60% of content is being licensed only in one member state. And this comes from the data of the recent e-commerce sector inquiry that DG Competition of the European Commission released a few weeks ago, in which it really shows that due to these commercial agreements, consumers are the ones that cannot access the content of their choice. But then we have to look at what is happening at EU level. And there are three very important elements. First, we have competition law enforcement, because geo-blocking, as we know it, have existed already in the past. We have it in the field, for example, of restriction of products, where they were not able to be imported to certain countries. And the EU have developed quite a lot of case law on this. Then we have, of course, the geo-blocking proposal and the copyright review. But if we look at what is happening at competition law level, Commissioner Vestager is doing I would say, a very, very good job in trying to build a single market for consumers, but from the point of view of competition law enforcement. So the Commission, maybe if you are aware, they started an investigation against 6 Hollywood studios and Sky UK, specifically on the question of the lack of cross-border access due to the agreements that restrict the possibility of consumers in other countries to access, for example, the services of Sky. This has created a lot of tension between right holders, distributors, the European Commission, and consumer associations, because in this particular case, we are supporting the Commission. So that has also put us in a special position. But after all, what we are asking is that do not block people. Consumers are willing to pay for content. And if they are not able to access it, it will be a terrible situation for everyone involved, because the result of that is the increase of piracy. Now if we look at the geo-blocking proposal. So, 25th of May of this year, the European Commission came out with this proposal where everybody thought, wow, now we're really going to tackle geo-blocking. Yes, but audiovisual services, for example, are excluded from this proposal. So the scope is rather limited, and do not address, unfortunately, the sector in which consumers suffers geo-blocking the most. Then we waited. I would say perhaps the copyright review will give us the answer. And then in September, the European Commission published its new reform package. And there is a very, very important instrument, which is this proposal for a regulation on online transmissions and retransmissions. Although the name is not very sexy, it doesn't tell us much, this is a very, very important instrument because it applies a model that we already have for the clearance of rights in satellite distribution to the online environment. And this is a very, very important precedent that we have in the EU because it's actually come to help the clearance of rights for cross-border distribution. The problem of the Commission proposal, it's again on its scope. It has a very limited scope of application. So in this case, it's mainly addressed to broadcasting organizations, but for example, video-on-demand platforms are excluded. What does it mean in practice? So basically, you are here in Poland and you would like, for example, to get a subscription with Netflix, the UK. You will prefer to see the catalog of Netflix from another country. Well, you won't find the answer to your problem here. It's not going to enable you to subscribe to foreign video-on-demand platforms. Nevertheless, this is an excellent starting point for negotiations and for the hard work that the European Parliament and the Commission and the Commission as well and the Council will have to do on this proposal. We do have a proposal, a suggestion of how to improve the situation. We believe that there is room there to address the problem of cross-border access without necessarily undermining territoriality. So territoriality was a word that was mentioned many times, and especially the audiovisual industry is quite concerned. What is important to bear in mind is that we want territoriality eventually. We want that content can be licensed for local adaptations. You need, if you have a movie that's going to distribute in several countries, the consumer of course wants to see it with different subtitles or aggregated with other content that meet their preferences. But it doesn't mean that this territoriality has to be absolute. So we have to work with several concepts that we have in competition law, this question of cross-border access restrictions, but also copyright law to make the life of those that want to distribute content easier. So our proposal is to work in the context of this regulation, but also look at the effect that it will have on consumers that are willing to access content or services from other member states. So very briefly, what can we do? So the scope of application of the proposal on online transmission or retransmission need to be worked out. There we have to look specifically at whether to extend it to video-on-demand platforms. We also need to look at the question of the contractual restrictions because competition law can provide an answer, but competition law applies on a case-by-case basis and always ex post. What we need is also an ex-ante solution and see how we can tackle these contractual restrictions in the legislation. The geo-blocking proposal of the 25th of May can provide some solutions, specifically on the issue of cross-border restrictions, what's called passive sales. Then we have to continue, and this is mainly the work of the European Commission and the member states, to enforce EU internal market law and, as we all expect, get closer to further harmonization of EU copyright law. Ultimately, what we need is to unlock the potential of the single market. It has been a very, very successful story for e-commerce. It has enabled companies to go across the border reach consumers in other countries, we have to create an environment that also happens with digital content services. We have an audience of 500 million consumers. Perhaps not all of them are going to access all the services available in the EU, but it creates a huge demand in which can benefit everyone. Can benefit, of course, consumers because they will have greater access, distributors because they will be able to serve those consumers that are interested in their services, but also the creative sector, because it's one less reason why consumers will have to turn to piracy. So this is my final message. We'll have many busy months ahead, and we hope that at the end of the day, whatever the EU legislature delivers is going to make a change in people's lives. Thank you.